When his teacher set him up to fail, he didn't just prove her wrong, he left her speechless. The hallways of Brookfield Academy carried a certain weight. It wasn't loud, not chaotic like some schools, just a quiet, polished order, like an old library where every whisper carried history. The floors gleamed, the air carried a faint scent of polished wood, and the students, most from well-off families, moved with the ease of knowing they belonged. Except for Jamal Richardson. Jamal wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of kid to push his way into conversations or demand attention. But anyone who paid close enough attention would know. He had something special. A gift, piano. It wasn't just playing notes for him. It was how he breathed, how he expressed things he didn't always say out loud. The instrument, with its 88 keys, had been his since he was 5, sitting next to his grandfather, who taught him not just how to play, but how to feel the music. The problem? Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore didn't believe he belonged here. She never said it outright, but Jamal could see it. In the way her eyes skimmed over him when she called on students, the way she gave James Carter, a boy from one of the wealthiest families in town, endless praise while barely acknowledging his own playing, and today was no different. "All right, class." Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the room, crisp, calculated. "Recital is in 3 weeks. I expect nothing but excellence. I assume you've all been practicing?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Jamal kept his hands folded on his lap, his sheet music tucked under his arm. He had practiced, every day, late into the night, but something told him that no matter how well he played, it wouldn't matter to her. Mrs. Whitmore scanned the room, her eyes landing on Madeline Pierce, a girl who came from a long line of classically trained musicians. "Madeline, let's start with you. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Begin." Madeline's fingers glided over the keys, each note polished, precise. The room sat in quiet appreciation, the kind of attention reserved for the best. Mrs. Whitmore smiled. "Lovely, dear. That's the grace I expect from my students." Jamal stayed quiet. He had played that exact piece, except he didn't just play it. He felt it. But he already knew Mrs. Whitmore wouldn't ask him next, and she didn't. She went through the usual rotation of students, each taking their turn, each receiving measured praise. And when she finally set down her clipboard, it was clear she was about to dismiss class without even acknowledging him. That's when James Carter spoke up. "What about Jamal?" The room shifted, eyes turned to him. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the tension to settle into Jamal's stomach, then a smile, tight, controlled. Of course, Mr. Richardson." Her voice dripped with something Jamal couldn't quite name, but he knew it wasn't encouragement. "Why don't you show us what you've been working on?" It wasn't a request. It was a test, a challenge, and Jamal felt it. But before anyone could say another word, he stood, adjusted the piano bench, and placed his fingers on the keys. The room was quiet, waiting, expecting, but not expecting what was about to happen. And that's when everything changed. Jamal took a deep breath, fingers hovering over the keys, the weight of the room pressed against him, not from the students, but from her. Mrs. Whitmore stood with her arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on her lips. This wasn't about the music. This was about putting him in his place. She expected him to stumble, to prove, once and for all, that he wasn't at the level of Madeline or James or any of the students she actually respected. The problem was, Jamal knew. He knew this moment was designed to humiliate him. And yet, a part of him didn't care, because once he started playing, it wouldn't be about her anymore. It would be about the music. He pressed down the first key. A deep, rich sound filled the room, not hesitant, not timid, full, confident, alive. The class, half distracted moments ago, suddenly stilled. He didn't start with the piece they were expecting, not the safe, structured Chopin they had heard 100 times before. Instead, he let his fingers flow. A mix of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, but with something else. His own rhythm, his own voice weaving between the classical notes. It was Chopin, yes, but it was also Jamal. And the room felt it. Even James, who had never truly paid attention to him before, sat up straighter. Madeline's brow furrowed, not in irritation, but in something close to awe. But the real shift? Mrs. Whitmore. She had started with that same smirk, the one that said, "I already know how this is going to go." But now, Now something flickered across her face, her lips pressed together, her fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to correct him. Because this wasn't what she had planned. He wasn't failing. He wasn't making a fool of himself. He was playing better than anyone in this room. The notes climbed, dipped, spun into something breathtaking. He felt his grandfather's lessons in every movement, every touch of the keys. Not just playing, but telling a story. And just like that, the air in the room changed. The students, who usually followed Mrs. Whitmore's lead, who never questioned who was considered the best, were now seeing something undeniable. Jamal wasn't just good, he was extraordinary, and Mrs. Whitmore knew it, which meant she had lost control. But instead of stopping him, instead of regaining her authority, she simply stared. Because what could she even say? And Jamal? He wasn't playing for her anymore, he was playing for himself. And that's when the real shift happened. The room was silent, except for the music. Jamal's fingers moved across the keys like they had a mind of their own, shaping each note, bending the rigid structure of the piece into something alive, something raw. It wasn't just Chopin anymore. It was something deeper, something his. He wasn't supposed to do this. Mrs. Whitmore had drilled into them that classical music was meant to be played as written, nothing added, nothing taken away. But Jamal had grown up listening to his grandfather talk about the soul of a song, how the notes on the page were just a starting point. So that's what he did. He felt the keys push back under his touch, responding to the weight of his emotions. Every soft note, every crescendo, it was all a conversation between him and the piano. And the class? They were listening, not just hearing, but listening. Even James Carter, who had spent the last 2 years acting like Jamal was invisible, was leaning forward, eyes locked on the keys. Even Madeline, who had always been the star of the class, sat motionless, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. But Mrs. Whitmore? She hadn't moved. At first, she had stood with her arms crossed, waiting for him to fail. Now? Her posture was stiff, her fingers gripping the clipboard so hard, her knuckles had turned white. This wasn't what she had expected. This wasn't what she had wanted. Jamal should have been nervous, should have let the weight of her stare sink into his skin, slow him down, make him second-guess himself. But he didn't. Because the second he let the music take over, none of that mattered anymore. The room shrunk. No more Mrs. Whitmore, no more students, no more walls. Just him. Just the piano. Just the sound that poured out, bigger than all of them combined. And then he hit the last note. It rang through the air, sharp and clean, before fading into a stillness so thick it felt like no one had even dared to breathe. For a second, nothing happened. Then, clap. Just one, then another, then an explosion of applause. James Carter shot to his feet. Yo, what? That was insane. Madeline, the girl who had always been the golden student, turned to Jamal with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open as if she was about to say something, but couldn't find the words. Even the students who had never spoken to him before were clapping, some shaking their heads in disbelief. And Mrs. Whitmore? She didn't clap. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, lips pressed together, staring at Jamal like she had just witnessed something she didn't know how to process. Jamal let out a slow breath, his heart still racing from the performance. He had done it, but this wasn't the end, because now all eyes were on her, and the real test was about to begin. The room held its breath. Every student was watching Mrs. Whitmore now, waiting. Her expression was unreadable, locked in place like she was forcing herself to stay composed, but Jamal could see it, the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers twitched around the clipboard. She wasn't just surprised, she was shaken. James Carter, still grinning, turned to her. That was crazy, right, Mrs. Whitmore? I mean, he just killed that. Others murmured in agreement. A few students looked back at her, expecting the usual praise, the kind she showered on Madeline and James, but it didn't come. Instead, Mrs. Whitmore inhaled sharply through her nose, flipping through the pages on her clipboard as if she hadn't even heard them. That was certainly an interpretation, she said finally, her voice clipped. The words felt thin, like she was reaching for something, anything, to downplay what had just happened. Jamal stayed quiet. He knew this was coming. She couldn't say it was bad, not with how the class had reacted, not with how undeniable it was, but she also couldn't bring herself to admit that he had just done something none of her top students had ever done. She cleared her throat. However, as I have said before, classical music is to be played as written. There is no need for unnecessary embellishments. The shift in the room was instant. The excitement that had just filled the air dimmed. Jamal didn't miss the way James's smile faltered, how Madeline's brows knitted together, like even she wasn't buying it. One of the girls, Sophie Green, hesitated before raising her hand. But wasn't that kind of the point? Mrs. Whitmore turned sharply. Excuse me? Sophie glanced at Jamal, then back at the teacher. I mean, we all played the same pieces the same way, but Jamal, he made it feel different, like real. A few students nodded. Mrs. Whitmore's fingers tightened on her clipboard. Jamal saw it then. This wasn't just about music. This was about control. She had spent years molding students, teaching them to follow her rules, her structure, but Jamal had just stepped outside of that. He had proven that music could be more than that. And worse, the students agreed. She turned back to him. Well, Mr. Richardson, she said, her voice carefully even, if you're so determined to play things your own way, perhaps you'd like to perform this piece at the recital. A challenge, a trap. She thought he would hesitate, that he would shrink under the weight of it, but he didn't. Jamal met her gaze. I'd love to. The room shifted again. A few students grinned. Others looked between him and Mrs. Whitmore like they couldn't believe what had just happened. And Mrs. Whitmore? She nodded stiffly, turning back to her clipboard. Good, she said. We'll see if your interpretation holds up in front of an actual audience. But Jamal could hear it, that edge in her voice, that frustration hiding behind her calm exterior, because for the first time in this classroom, she wasn't the one in control anymore, and she knew it. The moment the bell rang, the classroom erupted into hushed whispers. Jamal barely had time to stand before James Carter was in front of him, shaking his head like he still hadn't processed what had just happened. Dude, what was that? Jamal shrugged, stuffing his sheet music into his bag. Just played? James let out a short laugh. Bro, you straight up took over the room. I've never seen her look like that. Madeline, usually too polished to show much emotion, hesitated before speaking. I didn't know you could play like that. Her voice wasn't dismissive. If anything, it sounded almost embarrassed, like she had just realized how little she had actually noticed him before today. Jamal zipped his bag. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The music had already spoken for him. But across the room, Mrs. Whitmore wasn't done. She was still at her desk, pretending to be focused on paperwork, but her rigid posture gave her away. She had lost control of the narrative. For years, she had shaped this class, decided who was worth listening to and who wasn't. And Jamal? He had just flipped the entire system on its head. As the students filed out, Jamal felt her eyes on him. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Jamal wasn't worried. He had already won, and she knew it. As he walked toward the door, James nudged him. You're playing at the recital now, man. You ready for that? Jamal smiled. I was always ready. And just like that, he stepped into the hallway, leaving Mrs. Whitmore in the silence she had no idea how to fill. The night of the recital came faster than expected. Brookfield Academy's auditorium was packed. Parents, students, faculty. The kind of crowd that made some kids jittery, fingers shaking over the keys. But not Jamal. He stood backstage, listening as Madeline finished her piece. It was flawless, technically perfect, the kind of performance that would have been the highlight of the night. Except something was missing. It was beautiful, yes, but it didn't breathe. Jamal rolled his shoulders, shaking out his hands. He wasn't nervous, because tonight, he wasn't playing to impress. He was playing to be heard. A slow hush fell over the crowd as his name was announced. He walked across the stage, adjusting the piano bench as the lights warmed his skin. In the front row, he saw his mom, proud, smiling. A few seats away, he spotted Mrs. Whitmore, arms crossed, face unreadable. Jamal placed his fingers on the keys, and then he played. Not just Chopin, not just classical, but his version. Every note carried weight, shaped by years of playing in his grandfather's living room, by memories, by emotions too big to put into words. The melody moved through the room, filling every inch of space, pulling people into something deeper than just music. And when it was over, when the last note faded into silence, there was a moment of stillness. Then, the applause, louder than any performance before him. James and a few other students stood first, then more, then almost the entire room was on its feet. And Mrs. Whitmore? She didn't clap, but she didn't look away either. For the first time, she had nothing to say, because the music had said it all. As Jamal took his final bow, something shifted in the air. Not just for him, but for every student who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Tonight wasn't just about proving something to Mrs. Whitmore. It was about proving something to himself, and he had. Sometimes the world will try to put you in a box, tell you how to move, how to exist. But real power comes from knowing who you are and refusing to shrink for anyone. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever been told you didn't belong, remember this: your talent, your voice, your story matters. And when the time comes, let them hear it.